So I'd like to introduce you to Julia. Julia is one of the UK's leading psychotherapists for grief. She's been working with clients for over 30 years and has an MBE for her services. She's the founder patron of the Child Bereavement UK, where Prince William is the royal patron. She's written 2 best-selling books, Grief Works, on which the app's based, and then also This Too Shall Pass. And we're really happy to have worked with Julia on this app. So we really wanted to create this app because we realised a number of people, they either didn't want to see therapists or therapists were too expensive. And so we really wanted to make this accessible. And in addition to that, a lot of people often turn to books and YouTube and online courses. And while this information is great, it doesn't actually help you actively process your grief and ask you those difficult questions which you need to work through, which can actually help you process this. So it's been a real joy and a pleasure to be able to do this with Julia. Her expertise and her knowledge and her wit is really quite phenomenal, and I'm sure you'll see that coming out through the app and through the interview. So it's a real honour and pleasure, and I hope you enjoy this as much as I do. It's been a fantastic process working with you, and thank you so much for your time and helping putting this together. We really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure to do, and you know, from my experience of working with bereaved people, people feel like they've been thrown onto this alien planet where they don't know themselves. They really feel very distant from people around them. And, you know, grief is 24/7. So you can get therapy, you can see your friends. But the thing I really like the app is that people can access it whenever they need. And they can personalise it and make it their own. And they can go back to it as a kind of safe place. They don't have to ask anybody else. They don't have to kind of hope that a friend is available. They don't have to wait for their appointment to see a therapist. They can really kind of engage and resource their own resilience and robustness to weather the pain of grief, because as we talk about in the app, pain is the agent of change. So as they begin to kind of build a relationship with the app, they will, in a parallel way, build the relationship with themselves and their grief. And the grief changes them, and I think what the app will do will help the grief not harm them, but to develop and grow through it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So just to start, it'd be wonderful to hear a bit about your own experience with grief. I understand your family and your mother experienced a lot of grief in her life, and it'd be wonderful just to understand what your personal experiences were, and then also how that led you to become a psychotherapist.
So my parents were very much of the generation, what you don't talk about isn't going to hurt you, kind of forget and move on. And it was necessary. My parents were children of people who'd fought in the First World War, survived the First World War, and my dad fought in the Second World War. So there was very little therapy. There was absolutely no understanding of grief or trauma. And their first kind of need was to survive. And they survived very well, my parents. You know, they had 5 children and they had good lives. But the thing they didn't deal with and didn't know how to, and I would never expect them to, was face the kind of multiple and significant losses that they'd had themselves. So by the time my mother was 25, her mother, her father, her sister and her brother were dead. So her brother was killed in the war, her sister died of an asthma attack, and her mother and father died very young. So she was an orphan at 25. And she never talked about any of them. So there were these black and white photographs around the house of these wonderful people. And I knew vague snippets that my uncle had been very musical. My mum was better at sport than her sister, competitive even in death. And my mum is dead now. But she never talked about them and never really grieved them. And my dad, his father died very suddenly and unexpectedly of a heart attack, and his brother died in the dentist chair. So he had significant losses by the time he was 25. And what I learned was that what you don't say is in the end what harms you. I mean, they were fine and they were, you know, very loving parents, and I had a good childhood, but there was a limit to what they could manage. And one of the things with grief is that when you block the pain, so if your experience of grief, your emotional extension, if you like, of your self-emotion, if you have joy one end and pain the other end, if you block the pain, you also incrementally block your capacity to feel. So you can engage and get up and be very efficient, but your kind of spontaneity, your natural engagement with life is foreshortened.
Yeah.
And so I think that was the cost they paid. And I became curious about what people didn't say. And I wanted to know what was going on. So I was the youngest of 5 children. So my mum had 2 sets of twins. So she had 5 children in 4 years. So there wasn't a lot of space for me to speak anyway, because there were a lot of, 5 talkative children who were very young when we were all very young. But also I became much more interested in what people weren't saying than what they were saying.
Yeah.
And also being a twin, if you look at twins in the womb, they're completely interconnected. They push noses against each other, they suck each other's thumbs, their hands and their feet are pressed against each other. And I think I've always kind of wanted that kind of level of connection, not pressed into my clients' faces, but I've wanted to build very meaningful, connected emotional relationships with people. And in a way, my clients are more open with me than they may be with other people in their lives, because they dare to go to places and can expose aspects of themselves that they don't feel safe to do. I mean, they may do with their closest people in their lives, but often one of the difficulties in grief is that we somehow feel ashamed of it, that I should be okay, I should be getting on, I should be stronger than this. And what I hope with the app as well is that it will teach people that grief is healthy and normal and we are wired to adapt.
Yeah.
But we need to know how to do it. Yeah. And we have an enormous amount of ignorance, although we're in the 21st century. And I mean, one of the things I've actually often said when I'm teaching doctors and things is that people want the fast track app to fast track their grief. And so to some extent, we are doing that, but we're not fast tracking it. We're enabling them to engage with it and process it. And people can use it over a long period of time, although it's only a 28-day course.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And so just talking about the process of grief, obviously grief is a very individual experience, but at the same time, it feels like there is a process that people go through. And I think in your book, you talk really about kind of 3 stages almost, where you have pain being the agent of change, you have your 8 pillars of strength, and then you have your new normal. And it'd be wonderful if you could explain a little bit more about each of those stages that people often go through.
So the thing I kind of believe, and I don't know whether you do too, that people are as different on the inside as they look on the outside. So great. You and I, there are many things that are similar, but how we've experienced our life will shape us, and it will be very different. So there are universal aspects of grief that we can't avoid, but how each of us experiences them and how each of us expresses them is very different. But the thing that we can't avoid is the pain of the loss. And so the kind of expression I got to from witnessing for 30 years all these losses was that pain is the agent of change. Yeah. And the things that we do to block and avoid that pain are the things over time that do us harm. Yeah. So that we have to find a way of supporting and connecting to ourselves and connecting to others to enable us to withstand these kind of hits that feel like waves of grief that come through you and that you can't control them. Yeah. And the process is an oscillation between loss orientation, where you allow yourself to feel the pain, you focus on the grief, you emote and you grieve. And so that the tools in the app kind of give you that target to focus for yourself. And then you oscillate between restoration orientation, where our instinct, whatever happens to us, however devastating it is, to survive and to get on and to be okay. And that if you oscillate between the two, allowing yourself to do both, to both grieve at times, to have a break from grief, to go for a walk with a friend, to distract yourself, to do all the things that aren't so intense, that gives you the energy to go back and do the loss work. And then over time, you incrementally adjust to this new reality that you didn't want and you didn't choose. And the paradoxical theory of grief is that the more I can accept the aspects of the loss that I find unbearable and I want to resist, the more likely it is that change will occur. And then from that, you can grow.
So grief is one of the most difficult things we probably will experience in our life, losing a loved one. But have you found that in some ways this can actually make us grow stronger. And I think you refer to it as post-traumatic growth. And what are the instances in which we can grow stronger from it? Not that we ever wish the death occurred, but we can actually grow out of it. Are there certain kind of commonalities when that does occur and when it doesn't occur?
So what the research shows is that it never, as you say, diminishes the level of the loss or the level of the trauma. But that what people find once they have allowed themselves to go through this difficult process, that their perception of themselves, their perception of what matters in the world, and the perception of how they kind of look at life has changed. Mm-hmm. And they may have thought before, I could never have survived the death of my child, or I never could have survived the death of my dad. And they find that by allowing themselves and supporting themselves to adapt and change, that they're stronger than they imagined they would be. That what matters to them is much more about meaning in life and connection to other people and kind of the precious things of life than the things that bothered them before. So often the stuff that kind of gets in the way of life, the minutiae or the competitiveness or all those things fall away. And people describe that as growth. I obviously miss the person that died, but I feel through it I have changed. And I would say that change feels like growth.
Yeah. Just almost knowing that life is finite, it almost makes us treasure it more and makes it more precious. And are there ways to hold on to it? I always remember Michael Burke, he was out in a war zone. And I remember him saying that he almost got shot. And for a month afterwards, he just told everyone how much he loved them, how grateful he was. Then 2 months later, he went back to normal. And he always wished he could hold on to it. Are there any ways that we can actually hold on to that precious view of life and how rare and special it is and keep that with us?
I mean, I think to some extent, because we're adaptive, we're integrating our new experience, and so that's healthy. I mean, if you lived like you're going to die every day, it would be impossible to live at that level. But I think we can do habits like gratitude journals, I think really help, just even putting down 2 or 3 things every day that you're grateful for. They bring you back to your present. Any mindful meditation practice brings you back to the present, and then that takes you back to yourself and less with the hurry-scurry busyness of life. And when you're more centered, you're more heart-centered, and you're more you have more oxytocin in your body, so you're more aware of what really matters to you. And in doing that, you are more aware of the preciousness of life.
So, Julie, you refer to the new normal, and this is basically where you learn to become accustomed to your new way of living. You'll never go back to the same as it was before. But could you explain a little bit more about what that means and how we can move into this new normal in a healthy way?
I think the new normal is kind of navigating yourself in the world as it is now. And through grief, there will have been huge amounts of change. So you may have lost friendships. You may have moved house. You may have do a different job. You may have started a new relationship. So not only has your internal world really changed and been turned upside down, but also that can be matched by your external world being extremely different. And that doesn't mean that you don't carry your past. So our present is always informed and connected to our past, and we can kind of be thrown back at it at any moment. So the new normal isn't like you've got over the past or it is completely behind you, but it's informing you and you've integrated it as part of you as you're in your present new situation and place in life.
Yeah.
So one of the things clients often talk about, which seems very helpful, is that when they're in the intensity of the grief, people say to them all the time, you'll be okay, time is a healer, you'll get on with your life, you're a survivor, all of those things. And when they're in the thick of it, in those first months and months, if you look at the person that's died and you look inside them, they kind of feel like it's all of them. All of them is the person that's died. And the accommodation I talk to people about isn't that the person becomes less important. So that's really important, that they don't become diminished and less, because then you feel guilty, like you've somehow abandoned them, you don't care about them anymore. But the person and the shape of them, they often feel like there's a heart shape inside them, remains the same. But in the accommodation and in your new normal, you build your life around the loss. So you can still go back and access it at any point, and it's still very much part of you, but you build your life around it. And one of the images, which I actually don't particularly like, is it's an egg yolk. The yolk is in the middle, which is the loss, and then you have the yolk around the edge.
Yeah, wonderful. I think a lot of times we find it difficult to go straight into that grief after someone has died. And I remember listening on the app Clubhouse, someone was talking about the fact that I think their father had died, and it was during a period where she just started a new job, and she was working 60 hours a week, and she didn't feel it was appropriate to take time off because she wanted to make a good impression. But that carried on for 2, 3, 4 years.
Wow.
And what happens to us when we don't take the time to process our grief and we suppress it? Are there any kind of symptoms that we can see that come out if we don't take that time to go into it and process our feelings?
I mean, people are individual and unique. So there may be some people who haven't come to therapy, who I don't see, who get on with life and they suppress it. The research doesn't show that. What the research shows is that if you suppress that present loss, the death of her father, you may be able to do that for one loss, but when there's a new event in your life, a new loss, it could be even losing that job or moving house or another death, it always takes you to the place of where you experience grief. So a new loss will bring back your previous loss. And if you haven't done any of the work of grief to process that, then it'll come back harder. And what the research shows is that 15% of all psychological disorders come from unresolved grief.
Is that right?
So it's a risk. And also the mind and body are very interconnected, so that people who have unresolved grief are likely to have lots of physical difficulties, because the kind of negative spiral that you go into, if you're not engaging in life, you're probably not exercising, you may not be feeding yourself well, you may not be connecting with friends and family. So then, you get all the difficulties that come from that.
And out of interest, when you see your clients, typically, how many people come 6 months after a death or 1 year, 2 years later in comparison to people who are actually suffering from grief right now?
So, I mean, when people come and see me, it's often dependent on the circumstances of the death and the relationship they had with the person that died. So if it's a very traumatic and sudden death and it's a death out of time, people are suffering such huge levels of distress and pain that they need support much earlier. Sometimes the most kind of common time that people come to me for support is 3 to 6 months after the death, because for the first weeks, people feel numb. I mean, they feel the pain, but they feel numb, they're in shock. But after about 3 months, people go back to their lives and you're left alone, and you wake up with the kind of icy rawness of your grief. And it's quite hard to concentrate. You may have had to go back to work, but that's the point where people kind of go, oof, I'm not sure I can do this.
Yeah. And just touching on that topic of COVID, I saw a recent study from Bristol University was explaining how the suffering that's arising or the intensity of the grief seems to be higher than normal from COVID deaths. And I wondered if you've actually experienced that with the clients you're working with and why we think that might be so much worse.
I mean, the grief from COVID deaths is much more likely to be traumatic for many reasons. Firstly, the people who die from COVID, they died very often very suddenly. So they were, one day they were well, the next day they had a temperature, 2 days later they were in intensive care. And often, if they were quite frail, they died very quickly. No one had the opportunity to say goodbye. So, I mean, sudden, unexpected death, if you don't say goodbye, it's like having a half-finished sentence. And, couples who'd had a 50-year marriage, the partner was watching their husband or wife die on an iPad on their own because they were shielding, because they were vulnerable. And so then they would have a Zoom funeral that they didn't go. So all the things that we understand that help us kind of navigate the chaos and distress of grief have been completely taken away. Disconnection from people, opportunities to say goodbye, the rituals of funerals and mourning, and then the connection to other people. And also what's difficult about it is the majority of the people that have been bereaved are exactly the generation who don't tend to get support, so don't access it because they're the older generation.
So Julie, it'd be lovely to discuss a bit more about the different emotions people often experience when they go through grief. So there's often numbness, there can be anger, there can be anxiety. What are these range of emotions that people can kind of typically go through so they realise that it's not just them going through it, but it's actually a standard process of grief?
I mean, the emotions in our body are transmitters of information. And the purpose of them is to put our body on alert, like, oi, something is up. And so I think the most common and unrecognised grief emotion is fear. And that can go from kind of being scared to being terrorised, to feeling properly terrified. And then it comes with tons of other feelings that you often have at the same time. People can feel furious, they can be angry, they can be sad, they can feel immense despair, they can feel numb, they can feel kind of like they can't concentrate. Often it affects all their behaviours, so they're not sleeping well, so then they can't process things so well. They don't eat properly, so then they have low blood sugar and spikes. So it can be a real kind of cocktail of complex feelings that people don't have the emotional intelligence or being able to name them. So, I mean, one of the things I hope from the app is by going through each one, although grief isn't tidy, if we can take each feeling out and help people find a way of kind of recognising it in themselves and naming it for themselves, then that will help them navigate their internal processes without these sudden kind of starts of fear of like, what is wrong with me? I am going mad right now. But actually, if they can say, okay, I'm feeling really frightened, that's because I've been thrown into this very frightening new situation. It's normal that I should feel frightened. Kind of name your fear. Fear is anticipation of being hurt. I feel hurt, and I'm anticipating my future without this person that I love. So that makes sense. And then now what can I do to support myself given that I'm frightened? And often it's things that comfort you. If I'm really sad, let yourself cry. So the emotions are there for a reason, but when they come all together, all banged up against each other, they are very, very confusing and debilitating.
So a lot of it really stems out of this fear, and that's where anger can come from. It's all just different ways in representing that fear, even the numbness, trying to suppress it.
Absolutely. So fear is one of the big ones. I mean, anger can come from the circumstances of the death. It can come from the relationship with the person that's died. It can come from feeling hurt and just furious they've gone and died on me. I had a client who said to me, I was never really angry with my husband in his lifetime, but I could dig him up and kill him now because he's left me. So, I mean, you can't... You become this version of yourself that you didn't know and you really don't like. I mean, I think I talk about that in the app, that you get jealous when you see couples, or, you know, that before you went, oh, and now you go, you know. So it's so complicated and intense.
Yeah. And so a way to work with that, one of the first steps, I guess, is just recognising that, recognising how you're feeling.
Normalising it,
Okay.
And not turning on yourself. So, you know, when I talk about the shitty committee, the thing is to turn to yourself with self-compassion. Go like, ow, like, poor me. You know, oh, that really hurts. Rather than go, oh, I'm this horrible person now and the grief is ruining me.
Often we have complicated relationships with our loved ones, and when someone dies, we wish we'd treat them a different way. Either we wish we'd spent more time with them, or we just treat them in a better manner. And how do you comfort someone who does have that feeling of guilt that they could have done things in a different way, which would have been better? What do you say to them? How do you deal with that?
I don't think really there's comfort that you can give people, because the relationship is what it was. And so the task is kind of recognising the difficulty with someone who we've had a difficult relationship with is that now that they've died, there's no more opportunity to go back and put it right. And so in the way that you're talking about it, you might feel guilty that you wished you'd used that opportunity before. But also you may feel that the person that's died was really, unkind to you. But then you can't go back and tell them that they've been unkind to you. So the kind of task, and we have in the app a tool that can help you kind of process and look at the relationship with the person that died, is facing it as the reality as it is, and also finding ways of having self-compassion. Because in a way, what you're talking about is that we want control over what we feel.
Yeah.
And I think one of the kind of underlying aspects of the app and grief is that we can't control it. So it's working with it. Grief works. It's finding a way of working with this new status that we're in, and the feelings that we have, rather than thinking that we can tidy them up and sort them out.
Yeah, that's great. Often people are touched by grief in different ways and in different circumstances. And one example is grief and dementia, because often the person's still living at the time, but you're really losing them. You're losing their personality and everything about them. And how do you find there's a comforting way to work through that process while they're still living?
So I think it's a living loss. So the person hasn't died, but as you said, the person that they had been is no longer present. And so it's an adaptive process that has all the feelings of grief. So you can feel angry, you can feel sad, you can feel despairing, you can feel powerless. And it's while the person's alive. And often there's a shame when someone is seriously ill and they've got dementia or they've got cancer, because you can have those feelings. And also there may be a part of you that kind of wants it over, like I'm done with, because the pain of it is so great. And I think the big thing is to kind of recognise that it's natural to grieve, that those feelings, they're not in charge of them, that it's an adaptive response to the new circumstances that this person has got this illness. And also to recognise that feelings are not facts. I mean, I know I talk about this in the app, but the fact that you're angry with someone because they've got dementia or they've got cancer doesn't mean you're an angry person or you're a bad person. Don't conflate the feeling with being that person, that the feeling is there to give you information, and you need to kind of be compassionate to yourself given that you feel this. And, my big cry on all of these things is to get support from other people, the love and connection to others, so you don't do it alone.
Yeah. How does the grief process change if the fact it's a sudden death in comparison to it's a death whereby you have that period almost to say goodbye? How does that affect the grieving process?
So a sudden and unexpected death, one of the ways I think about it is that it's like normal grief, but with the volume turned up. So all the normal experiences that you have are much more intense. You're much more likely to be traumatized, and you're very likely to have a physiological response. So your body might go into shock, you might be shaking, you might feel kind of broken, you might not be able to sleep or eat. And it takes much longer to process. And some of it is, as you say, that you don't have the opportunity to say goodbye. And all the regrets, all the what-ifs. And if it was sudden and unexpected and you'd had a fight about who didn't put the bins out that morning, or you hadn't told them that you love them that day, those kind of ramp up the intensity of the grief. And so it just makes it more complicated.
And during those times where you do get the opportunity to say goodbye, someone's got a terminal illness, what's the best way to interact with them, to give them support, to give them comfort in their dying process? Do you have any advice around that?
As we talked about before with dementia, grief starts at the point of diagnosis, when the person in front of you, or yourself if you're facing your own death, if you know you have a life-limiting or life-threatening illness, how you see your present and your future is turned upside down. And so you grieve for this limitless future that you hoped and had maybe every right to expect. And what's incredibly important in families is to have those difficult conversations, to talk about together what the person who is dying may be frightened of, what they may want for their funeral, what they want to be remembered, having an ethical will. having an end-of-life plan, because all the things that you haven't talked about before someone has died are opportunities for regret and huge amounts of distress after they've died. So, I mean, I would say to everybody, have these conversations years before they're likely to die, when you're not under the pressure of a diagnosis. But if you are under a diagnosis, then, you know, people kind of think, if we don't, people have magical thinking, and they think, if I don't think about it and if I don't talk about it, my love for them will keep them alive. And if I let myself know that they're going to die, I'm somehow failing them, because in not believing they're going to live past their diagnosis, or they are going to die, I'm being a bad mother, or I'm being a bad partner.
Yeah. So, Julie, it'd be wonderful if you talk us through the different types of grief people experience.
So if someone has a baby that dies, a miscarriage or a stillbirth, people are grieving the future they had every right to expect and hope for. So the minute someone sees the blue line in a pregnancy test, they don't see a fetus or a number of cells. They see themselves as a family with this new child. Yeah. They see themselves pushing the pram down the street. They see the baby chair in the back of the car. They start already thinking about how they're going to work around having another child. Will they work? All of those things. And it's complicated because the task of mourning is facing the reality of the death. And with a pregnancy, whether it's a miscarriage or whether it's a stillbirth, you have memories of the pregnancy and you may have the scans, but you don't have memories of the relationship. Yeah. And so it's very important at the time of the death and after the death to spend time with the baby. And, you know, through our work at Child Bereavement UK, we've changed practice in every hospital in this country so that people have time where they hold the baby, they create memories. Because for grief, you need memories to focus your grief on. Right. So it may be a picture of a stillborn baby that you're holding, but that you have the opportunity to parent that child and have memories of parenting that child, although they've died. And I think one of the big misunderstandings is miscarriage is that people often equate the level of the loss with the number of weeks of pregnancy. And that is by no means the case. It is the emotional investment in the pregnancy that predicts how much loss it is. So it may be that you've had 4 IVFs and this is the first pregnancy that you've had. And you may have got to 12 weeks and you think you're past the difficult line. You know, once you're 12 weeks, your 1 in 4 miscarriage stats go up. You're much more likely to have a healthy baby. But then you have a miscarriage and you feel utterly devastated. So none of us know. And so for people who are grieving the death of a baby or a child, you know, the important thing is to acknowledge that this is something they really need to support themselves to go through. And often I think people think what you don't know, what you haven't seen, you're not going to miss. And people miss the future they dreamed of. And that is that's a tough thing to grieve.
I think one other thing I noticed, we experienced it within our family, was just actually how common it is. So when we're going through this process, we're explaining it to other friends, and often they'd been through this stillbirth process, often way beyond 3 months.
So 1 in 100 babies is a stillbirth. 1 in 4 is a miscarriage. And there are 700,000 babies born a year.
But it's interesting how often people don't really talk about it unless you share yourself. And then suddenly you realise, and I know this family member felt so much more comforted in a strange way, just knowing that other people had been through it, but they really feel quite isolated because you don't hear about this in everyday life.
Because of the focus for the grief being creative, having memories of the baby that died, choosing the clothes to wear, maybe bathing the baby, taking a photograph of the baby. I encourage families to take the baby or the child home.
Really?
So that they can have an image of them at home, because there's maybe been this empty cot that's been waiting for a baby.
That's right,
And so putting the baby in it and then having the funeral director collect the child from their home feels much more loving than from a funeral director's. So it's humanising it that really matters. And we have changed practice. I mean, it is better, but it's extremely painful.
Yeah, because at first it feels quite... it almost feels cruel and difficult to have to experience that. But I think looking back, they're so grateful they had these photos of them all holding hands, and it's really quite beautiful that we do that and it's been acknowledged that that's a way to deal with it, but it can be very, very difficult. The other type of death which would be interesting to talk about is suicide. How do people best deal with suicide? Because again, it's a sudden death, but it's complicated in a number of different ways.
Suicide, I mean, there is never a hierarchy in grief, but suicide has layers of complexity that makes it extremely tough. And partly it's the guilt, but partly it's the revolving door of what ifs. What if I had telephoned? What if I had done this? What if I hadn't done that? And the sense of failure that somehow, if I'd been a good enough parent, partner, child, the person that I love wouldn't have died. Well, I worked with a family where the dad killed himself, and the child said to me, "Everybody tells me Dad loved me, but it doesn't feel like it." And so you feel like either the person that killed themselves don't love you, or you didn't love them enough to keep them alive. And one of the things I talk to families about is that suicide is like a heart attack of the brain. Mm-hmm. So that we know that a young person can suddenly, out of the blue, walking down the street, have a heart attack, where the firing in the heart, just the electrics just fuse. Yeah. And in the same way, I think of suicide as there's some kind of massive fault that happens in the brain where the person is completely disconnected from those around them. And, when I've talked to people who've had suicidal ideation, they kind of go to a very different place in themselves. Like they can plan it while they're functioning. So that there's two parts of them. There's the kind of dark bit that's planning their death that feels, the pain is too great, I can't do this anymore, while they're making telephone calls, while they're going to work. Yeah. But the moment of the death, when people actually do kill themselves, is when there's a complete kind of fusing, a heart attack of the brain. Yeah. And it's incredibly painful, incredibly complex.
Actually, one thing I did want to touch on when we're discussing stillbirth is actually the relationship between the parents, because often they go through the process in different ways, and it can be very tumultuous and a big strain on the relationship. And is there any advice you can give to couples to help them through that process together?
Whenever a couple is bereaved, and it may be through a stillbirth, which has a particular complexity, but it can also be other deaths in a family, the couple may grieve differently. A man and woman tend to grieve differently. Women tend to be loss-oriented, that they emote, they grieve, they have this sort of ruminating Sherlock Holmes obsession with every minute of what happened. Men tend to want to get on. They tend to want to move forward. They tend to want to make plans. They're restoration-oriented. And so in a couple, she can think he's like a selfish git, and he can dread going home because she's kind of wet rag that never stops crying. When there's a stillbirth, it's another level of complication is that the mother often feels like she's a failure, that somehow she did something wrong, that her body failed her, and that he doesn't understand and doesn't get it. And also there's the added complication of they still want another child. And so she has to overcome that barrier of fear to dare to let herself trust again, to dare to let herself be pregnant again, and then go through the pregnancy. And he probably wants a child much quicker than she does. He may be ready for it. I mean, not always by any means, because, nothing is always. But for a couple, it's a very intense process. And the only thing that helps them is communicating, is telling each other and allowing each other to have their differences, to be different, and to voice them, and not try and kind of push the other one to be like the other one.
Yeah, sure. Julia, it'd be great to talk to you more about how do we help others deal with grief, and in particular, children. So how do we actually describe death to children, and what's the appropriate way to do it at different ages? That question gets asked to me a lot.
So the kind of understandable instinct of parents is to protect children from the truth, because they don't want them to suffer and they don't want them to be scared. But actually what we know for children of all ages, and much younger than we would ever imagine, is that children need the same truth as all the adults around them. So that children, what they don't know, they make up. And what they make up is much more frightening than the truth, because our imagination is limitless. And also children, and I think adults too actually, have magical thinking.
Yeah.
So if they're told, Daddy has gone to heaven, or we've lost Daddy, heaven can be a hamburger joint that's around the corner that they can go to every day, and they lose things all the time that get them back. So the thing that children need to know is that death is irreversible. And the way at Child Bereavement UK we talk about it, and it's well evidence-based, is to tell a child that whoever it is has died, and use the dead word, not gone to heaven, not passed away, but to use the dead word. The person has died, and that means that their body doesn't work anymore. They may look like they're asleep, but they're not asleep, they've died. And children can really manage the truth. It's adults who find it very difficult.
Oh, that's so interesting.
And to include them in the funeral, in the plans, so that they participate in it. Because what I see decades later is children who are sent to the aunt or sent to the grandmother who have no memories, who have no focus for their grief, and feel like they were excluded and diminished by it. And so then they're angry that they didn't participate in their father's or their mother's or their siblings' death. And they have no memories. And then that is much more likely to be complicated grief, which brings with it all those difficulties.
And when we have a friend who's suffering from grief, or even a colleague, maybe someone a bit more distant that you don't know so well, but you know they're going through the bereavement process, and often there's this kind of awkwardness about, should I say something, should I not? Do you have any advice about the best way to approach grief with someone else who's suffering from it?
I think when you're coming up to somebody who's grieving, who's either been recently bereaved or actually 6 months later, the best and really simplest thing to do is acknowledge it, to say, I'm so sorry, and the name of the person who's died. There's this kind of thought that I'm going to remind them and upset them of the person that's died.
100%.
You're not going to be reminding them. They will be thinking of that person 24/7. And the thing to do is to acknowledge it and say it in the simplest way that you can. I'm so sorry that he's died. And then track the person where they go with it. So if it's a colleague who clearly doesn't want to talk about it, who says, thank you very much, and then talks about a work issue, don't say, oh, no, I want you, don't drag them back. Go with them with their work.
Yeah.
But if you're a close friend, be the friend that shows up. So be the friend that doesn't just send a text saying, I'm thinking of you, let me know if there's anything I can do. But be the friend that actually walks through the door, sits with your friend, lets them cry, lets them not talk, takes them for a walk, takes the children away so that they can have a break, and do it for much longer than most people think. Because grief takes longer than most people want. And, many friendships are broken on the hill of grief, and many friendships are made on it, because the people who show up are often the ones that are most surprising.
Yeah. And speaking of timelines to work through the grief process, I mean, some people feel like it's going to be never-ending, and some people think, has it gone on for just too long? Is this normal? Is there a set time period that's appropriate and that isn't appropriate? How do you, explain to someone how long it might take to get over a bereavement?
When clients ask me, how long am I going to feel this bad? I normally say it takes longer than you want, and I don't know. But the level of the loss will be affected by the relationship with the person that's died, the circumstances of the death, your history of loss, so how much loss you've had, your personality type, and the love and connection to others. And all of those will influence how you manage this grieving process. Yeah. And if under each of those lenses there's a lot of history, a lot of difficulty, then it will take a long time because you're dealing with so much difficulty. But what people talk about is continuing bonds, that the work of grief is to find a reality to face that the person that you love has died, and to find a way of living given that they've died. But the relationship with the person never dies, that the love continues. So that you can be 25 years later walking down a street, having woken up on a happy day, you've got a good life, and you smell chicken curry that was the person's favourite meal. And at that moment, you're thrown back in time 25 years as if they died yesterday, and you can get a huge whoosh of grief.
Yeah.
But that's natural. And as long as you don't block it, it comes through you, and then maybe 10 minutes later, you're back on track.
Yeah.
So it's not fighting it and kind of recognising it, that it is a lifelong process that becomes part of you.
Yeah. Often in life, we have separations from loved ones who haven't died, like breaking up with a partner, and often it feels like a death, and in many ways it is, because we often don't see them again. Is that grieving process similar to when someone actually dies?
Definitely. I mean, I would term that a living loss. Mm-hmm. So it has a breakup of a relationship or a divorce, has all the emotional components of grief from death. Mm. But at some level, has its own particular significance because the person is alive and getting on with their life. So you can really derail your grieving process if, for instance, you're following them on Instagram and you're seeing they're having this happy life without you, or you have a lot of unresolved issues with them that they refuse to talk to you about. Mm-hmm. So how relationships end, how the partner continues in life, and what your outcomes are that you have another relation has a massive influence on how you manage that living loss.
And so do you have any advice on the best ways to do this? Like, is it better to cut off 100% and delete them from your Instagram?
I mean, most divorces where you have children, the thing that damages the children most is the difficult relationship with the partners. Yeah. So for children's outcomes, if you've separated as parents, you have to find a way of building a good enough relationship that you can communicate, that you can make decisions, that you're not kind of being brutal about each other behind each other's backs. Yeah. If you've had a relationship with someone where there is no present kind of reason to be connected with them, I would suggest, certainly for the first 2 years, that you have no connection with them. Because the minute you see them, your body remembers, your body holds the score, and it ignites all the longing and the good bits that you had, and you forget the bits that led you to break up. Yeah. So that often you can want to have sex straight away, and then you throw yourself back to have to do all the work again. Yeah. And that happens all the time. Yeah. And I think social media is, it makes everything from that point of view much more difficult.
It prolongs our pain.
It prolongs the pain. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I would say for all losses, which is why I believe in the app so much, is that we need to support ourselves to do this. We cannot do it alone. Simple things. You lose your pen, fine. You buy another one. Straightforward loss for someone you have a straightforward relationship that isn't a death out of time, that isn't a very significant loss. You may be able to just be a bit sad for a time and get on with your life. Most relationships are not that straightforward, and we cannot do them on our own. Yeah. So we need all the kind of tools that are available to us. We need love and connection to others. We need the app. We may need therapy as well. We need to take care of ourselves. We need to do the things on the 8 pillar, because otherwise the process gets stuck in us, and then that affects all our outcomes going forward, all our future relationships. Yeah.
And do you think we're more isolated these days from our loved ones and family who typically years ago would give us support? And actually it's making the grief process more difficult for us than it would have been 200 years ago?
So, I think in some ways we're more virtually connected, digitally connected, but we are socially disconnected. Mm-hmm. And what matters in our lives is the quality of our relationships and the meaning that we have from those relationships. And for that, we need to prioritise our relationships. So if you look at all the research, there's a brilliant Harvard study that looks at outcomes. Mm-hmm. And what that says is that people who have good, reliable, loving relationships live longer, are wealthier, healthier, have better memories, and don't suffer so much pain. So if there's a single thing that matters to us most in our lives, is love. And that includes the risk of loving where love can end. And that can be through death or through separation. And so it's a tricky one. But when we don't have love, we have much worse outcomes on every level.
That makes a lot of sense.
If you look at the transgenerational trauma in families from losses, from unspoken suicides, from murders, from depression, from alcoholism, you can track the patterns of behavior and the patterns of psychological fragility in a direct line from the transgenerational injuries.
Right.
And so if you want to know yourself and support yourself, go back and track your family's history. And that will explain and give you many answers.
So often people find it very difficult on particular anniversaries of a death or on a birthday. And how do you suggest that people deal with those particular dates?
I mean, I think the thing with anniversaries or other holidays, like which are normally happy, like Christmas or your own birthday, is that they now have this layer of the person that is missing. So it may be the anniversary of the death, and often people want to kind of don't know what to do with it. And often the build-up to the date of the anniversary is like Jaws music. It's like boom, boom, boom. And so I get people to talk around together around the kitchen table, like, what are we going to do on the anniversary? You cannot pretend it's not going to happen. Yeah. So what is a way that we can remember and have a touchstone to the memory of the person that's died? Is it to go to a church and light a candle? Is it to be in your kitchen together and say a prayer or a poem together? Yeah. Is it to have a memory box that lots of people have put the memories in and sit around with cake and tea and talk about the person that's died? And then do something that's comforting. So the balance is always marking the loss, naming it, do something that is a ritual. So a ritual is like a normal kind of aspect of life that we give added meaning, that elevates it to make it special. Yep. So you have a ritual, and then you do things that comfort you, and often that's food. That's often sitting around a table, you know, having roast chicken or whatever your thing is. And those are really important days. Yeah. In the app, we have a tool that can help you support yourself when there's a particularly difficult, significant day. So it'd be how you're going to structure the day, how you can contact friends, the support you need, what you might use to soothe you, and how you can kind of manage yourself through the day.
So Julie, can you tell us more about why you wanted to create this app?
I wanted to create an app for people who are grieving, whether it's the death of someone or a living loss, someone who's separated and experiencing a loss, because grief is so confusing, it's so isolating, people feel completely thrown by it. And the single thing that helps them is understanding themselves, understanding their relationship with the person that's died or the end of the relationship that they've had, how they can soothe themselves, what the emotions are from grief. And through the app, it's a structured way so people feel contained by the structure. And it gives them all the kind of understandings that I've had in 30 years that I've seen work for people, so that they can use it over and over, whether it's journaling, whether it's a meditation, whether it's exercise, whether it's structuring a day that's a Memorial Day. So all of those things, it's there in a simple app. And I think people will use it and find it incredibly helpful. So I'm delighted that we've done it, and I can't wait for it to get out there and people to have the opportunity to help themselves by using it. So one of the things that I'm particularly proud of and excited about the app is that it is the best of digital technology, in that, you know, grief is very universal. Everyone suffers from grief, but by no means can everyone always get the support that they need. And I think that by accessing the app, it sort of extends my reach, in that what I've learned, what I know, the years of hours I've spent with people, the times I've written and talked, is in one little, tiny little quarter inch on someone's phone that they can get for themselves in a way that they could never get from me or other experts on your platform. And I think that feels incredibly exciting and a way of democratizing knowledge and skill and expertise for anyone to be able to have, not just those that can afford it.